So a few words about Grant. He thrives on helping organisations and communities develop their capability to adapt in a fast-changing world. A global thought leader on transition, he is a member of the Board of Trustees for the Global Association of Transition Engineering and has authored over 100 articles related to transition. He works at the forefront of capability development, research and development of transition strategy, standards, risk management and resilience, grounded in fundamental science, engineering, economics and social change. So Grant, let's hear it from Grant, and there may be a screen sharing.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Hugh. Welcome everybody. I'll just share my screen and we'll get going. Just before we do that, I'd like to, for those who didn't catch that, there's a fair few people on the call that, I'm just trying to organise my screen here, fair few people on the call that either know me or I've worked with in the past. So you'll have a good understanding generally that my experience goes right back to the late 70s and coming through from in the construction sector. So the reason I mention that is my life has been full of engineers ever since. So every year that I've worked since 1979, I've been doing projects and doing things which have naturally involved engineers, because we've been doing things that have had to make a difference, who had to be real, had to be right, you know. So the reason I mention that is that, albeit that it seems natural to me that, you know, engineering is a thing, it's not always that way, as I found out as I've gone along. So I thought today was an opportunity to actually start to explore that a little bit, and perhaps post up some challenges for the community here to think about engineering as part of the transition, and how you might actually take a step forward, move forward, or develop your capability as you go. My particular interest in the transition and transition engineering really got a boost when I met Susan Grundyke about 12 years ago. And again, we caught up back in 2018 and she introduced me to Fiona Van Petergem, and Fiona and I have been tirelessly dedicated to working on how we get transition engineering out into the world and into practice. So we started Transition HQ as a way of being having a vehicle to do this work and for people to relate to. It's just a little niche consultancy, but with a specific idea of advancing evidence-based transition. And as I say, we've been applying and developing transition engineering principles through a little bit of consulting and development of education product and delivery of those. And we have a relationship with University of Canterbury, the epicentre there, and also with Susan up here at Watt. Now, I'd like to challenge the group here just to grab, if you haven't already got a piece of paper and a pen, just grab a piece of paper and a pen and perhaps note down perhaps any different questions that come to mind through this presentation, because what we're finding is that we just don't get different outcomes. We're not going to be a different system or a different community or different individuals next year if we don't start changing the questions that we're asking. And it's quite convenient just to sit back and not ask new and different questions. And therefore we just slip into business as usual. So if you can think of any new questions that come up out of this presentation and you want to either come back to me later or we discuss them at the end of the presentation if we've got time, that would be a good thing. What I want to cover here is just grounding this presentation and the issues that we do face. So what's at stake? This won't be a surprise to any of you at all, but it does pay to remind ourselves, because the normalisation of you know, the issues we face is actually a problem that I think that engineers should step up to maintaining the line on and holding the line on. I think also there's just a general lack of understanding of the transition generally, and there's a number of reasons for that we'll talk about. And then I've got 4 areas of specific issues that I see for the engineering practice and potentially other professions as we go through the transition, and then it challenges to where to from here. Sorry about that. Okay, so most of you will have seen this diagram sometime or other. Basically, it's showing sort of systemic basins and trajectories, and you know, we're kind of heading in this direction here. At some point, we either need to turn and go across to here, or we're going to drop into this hothouse space. That's probably not news to anyone, but the question is, when is that going to start happening? When are we going to start turning? And you know, the turning is not necessarily apparent with the things that we're seeing in the media and the way things are evolving. The major turning point was, of course, around the 1950s, post Second World War. And I put this little kind of equation there for the maths folks in the room. It might not be right, but you know, marketing, financialization, technology, and population have just massively increased the impact of use of energy and materials. So these things have just combined, and the point about highlighting there is that yellow piece is incredibly challenging. It's incredibly difficult to deal with, and this is what I think we're facing is, you know, how do we work with you know, the financial sector and the marketing and the advertising and the ongoing consumption to actually make a difference. I raise that because it's not not common knowledge, but it just pays to remind ourselves that there are forces there which are substantial. Here's another graph which came out of the IPCC report. Nothing new here except about the phenomenal trajectory that we're hoping to achieve, which is probably ridiculous and probably won't happen. But at least I would say there that we're setting expectations for doing something. And that something has to be interdisciplinary in nature, and it's going to challenge all of us, and it's going to challenge in particular professions, including engineering. You know, to make the kind of downshift that we hope to and need to, we really need to challenge what's going on and what's actually happening in the profession. But and you know, the vast majority of people are either blind or in denial, or both. This was, I'm not expecting everyone to read this fully, but on the left-hand side, Daniel Kenning, who is a collaborator in transition engineering with Susan Crumdyke. Daniel's the chair of the board of the Global Association of Transition Engineering. He put up a very reasonable post on LinkedIn about the announcement that, yeah, we're just going to go full out on growth in the UK recently. And in total, there was about 25 people did likes, and there were a couple of people who actually pushed back on it. And, you know, to me, it just signified the you know, the general condition that we face, that people are just doing what they want, just going generally in the direction that they feel is the right thing to do, or they, you know, for whatever reason, they're lacking awareness, they're lacking motivation, they lack skills to engage in this stuff. They're locked into some sort of path dependency. So, you know, it's a challenge. There's not much support for taking sensible action around transition, and this problem exists at all levels. And to some extent, I honestly believe that you know, the government is deeply part of this, because the system of governance and government has evolved in a growth world, and it depends on that growth world. So, you know, there's a lot of feedback loops, a lot of connections, and a lot of lock-in that we're actually having to deal with here. So again, this is really the point of raising this, is that it is the condition that we're trying to work in as engineers, as transition people, as communities trying to move forward and survive or adapt to what's happening. As I mentioned before, I think there's some specific challenges. I have written about some of these and some of the articles I've written. I will go into these in a bit more detail in a minute, but perceptions of engineering, the sheer variety of engineering that's emerged over the years, standing out as a problem. How do we get recognition, or how do we actually engage in the conversations that need to be engaged in around transition? And the perpetuation, or the, you know, the standardization or the assumptions around how we do things are also an issue, I think, for engineering. And we need engineering all the way. I mean, to get to this future, you know, it's got to have engineering involved in it. So these things are important, but there are challenges. This graph here is just one page out of a survey that Engineering Canada did. It's just one example. The familiarity of engineers was second to last in this particular survey. So, you know, people understand what a nurse does, and a doctor does, and an electrician does, and a lawyer does. You know, engineers are further down the list. Now, that may or may not be a problem, but it's a fact. So engineers are not high up on the familiarity list. But as I say, generally, you know, over all of the work we've done, we constantly hear people say engineers are trusted. They get things right because they have to, because the rubber meets the road with the engineering. We know that they're always professional, is the feedback that we get, and have specific and necessary skills, but often stereotyped as kind of geeks or poor communicators or overly pedantic. They've got the, you know, the back room guys, the guys that you get to do the work but you claim the credit, sort of thing. You know, the bean counters and the marketing people and the product, you know, innovators are always going, look how good we are, when it's actually the engineers in the back room doing the work. So the profile for engineering tends not to be perhaps where it could be, is what I'm suggesting here in this one. Again, not to try and read these, but there is masses of them. I mean, this I went to a site and it looked at, you know, I just said, well, what are the, you know, general fields of engineering? There's 51 of them on this page. Now, they all have a specific need, and they all, you know, are expert, you know, these people are all experts in their fields. But what is that saying to the rest of the world? What is that saying outwardly to the people that want to be involved in transition or to engage in transition? there has to be consequences for this level of variety and this potential sort of almost, difficult to engage in field or thing that we call engineering. So I would just, I've put that up there to sort of challenge the group to think about that. It's just outwardly, you get used to your field, whether it be mechanical engineering or electrical engineering, or whether you're in the ecological space or whatever it is. But when you start doing the transition at a local level with communities and in a social context, how are people going to work their way through, what does an engineer do, and how can we get the right one, and how should they be involved? So again, that's just another thing, the significant variety there. This slide here is absolutely not about trying to represent anything in any sort of representative form in terms of scale or anything. The idea is I just want you to get a sense that the noise and I use the term swirl out there is just unrelenting. You are up against misinformation, disinformation, the greenwash, there's all sorts of people trying to do the right thing. We have degrowth, and we have circular, and we have sustainability, and we have all these terms, and we have all these focus areas. And in this world, there is just so much swirl that I'm just sort of suggesting, how do you stand out? How does engineering carve out its place or its niche at a particular time, in a particular place? So again, that's a challenge. We talk about transition engineering, and we talk about doing engineering for transition. Well, it's pretty easy for people to get distracted away from what actually the need is or what the problem is, because there's so many other competing interests. And I'll give you a real example. So we consult with a regional council here, and some of the work that we get involved in, all of a sudden someone will put their hand up and go, oh, but there's somebody over there that's doing another sort of variety of that, or there's another initiative over there that's doing circular, and and so there's this constant noise and this constant debate about who's doing the right thing or what is the right thing to do. So I suggest that being relevant in this noisy world is actually a huge challenge, not just for engineers. In some respects, you would say, well, there's lots of people doing really good work, but how do they show up? How do they differentiate themselves in this world? I put a couple of little black spots in there just to show the odd engineer, by the way. Here's an example of kind of the world being locked into old ways of doing things. So in our experience, we've come across the procurement system, the demand side, client side, and the supply side, the professionals, the engineers and so on, are still working out what transition's all about. The clients do not know what to commission. They do not know what to ask for transition. They don't know what to procure. They're asking themselves, oh, we're being marketed to by Deloitte, or a consulting firm, but then should we get a civil engineering firm, or should we get an interdisciplinary engineering firm, or should we just go and talk to our accountant? How do we tackle this thing called transition? And then on the other side, we've got the engineering companies fighting and squabbling and competing with one another about what services should be offered and how they should position them with clients. So there's this huge gap that we see between the demand understanding what it needs and the supply side understanding what it should be provisioning for transition, for interdisciplinary work. It's very easy for people to say, oh yeah, well, I just need a bit of mechanical engineering. Excellent. Let's draw that up. Let's do the specification. We'll go to market. Everyone can get best price, best practice, lowest risk. They can have competing, things so they can be assured they've got the cheapest price and all of that. Great, guys. But that's just the piece. That's just one little piece that you've just done, which may or may not be relevant. It may not be integrated. It may not be successful. Any of those things. So when we talk about, commissioning transition work and supplying transition services, there's a huge gap. And we're locked into predominantly assumptions and models around procurement that were invented, years ago, and really don't enable us to do this sort of work, much less in the time frame that it needs to be done. These things are urgent, and we're just simply doing what we've always done. So we're potentially institutionally locked in, as we talk about when we're talking about it on Real Transition Leaders coursework. But that's just one example of institutional lock-in, but it's a pretty big one, because currently the government, the all of government group, they are all wedded to lowest cost, best practice, competitive tendering, and those ideologies and beliefs simply do not encompass or accommodate integrated transition at this stage. So, as I said before, the slope of that pointy arrow is an indication of this all has to happen pretty quick. Probably won't be happening that quick, but at least it gives us a metaphor for taking some action. What we do know is the question that how relevant will we be in this fast changing world has to be a question we're asking continually. We have to be pursuing that question every week, because everything needs to be changing. And this will be a learning journey for decades. Susan and I have talked about this. We're really just at the start of what will be decades, if not a century, of transition. So the question becomes, how do we become or stay relevant in that changing world? Or we just check out, we can just check out and sit on the sideline and, as they say, pay for the retirement you deserve, or whatever it is the advertisement is. So I think our challenge is to put to the engineering profession would be to be thinking about this stuff and working on it. So the question becomes where to next for engineering, and this is a little sketch drawn by an engineering colleague of mine, and he's suggesting that we ought to be trying to play the middle gap there between getting the balance between evidence and belief right. And on the right hand side of that slide there, I've put up a bunch of the skill sets and competencies that we aim to advance in Real Transition Leaders and the work we're doing in that space. But what I would say is the very important pieces out of that is where we end up is that we have to be able to work with people in place. So transition, as we know, is going to happen in localities at particular times, and there are people there working at grassroots level, and we need to be able to build trust with those people. We need to be able to connect with those people and understand how they contribute to this transition. And a lot of that work is not just engineering, it's actually social change. It's actually it's looking at the situation. It's about getting people together and helping them stay together in conversation. and doing the work together. But there's certainly a whole bunch of engineering in there, and my, you know, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd say that if we could have engineers that could do all those things on the right-hand side, that would be excellent. So maybe some new questions about that, that would be great. We've got just a working definition here for the real transition. And the real transition is really a couple of things. It's talking about the pathway that we actually need to find and navigate, and that's different for every place, every community. You know, everyone's got different conditions and different requirements and different phasing. So finding that and navigating that safe and peaceful transition in a place. We want to secure the future viability of the civilization or the people in that place. We're aiming to protect and regenerate the environment or the biosphere at the macro level. And it's got to be a feasible transition. It's got to be you know, within the limits that we've got there. It needs to work at the local level. So it's an interdisciplinary thing. And I think the challenge is that as engineers, as professionals in many different fields, we need to be able to work together to find those pathways and work in an interdisciplinary way. So that's what we call the real transition. And the piece that's in there that we try to help people with is actually the transition of your own capability, of your own mindset. So it's not just a academic exercise about learning about some, you know, calculations and some methodology and some frameworks and some ratios. It's actually about a transition of your own mindset, your own perspective. So much of what Susan and Daniel's work around transition engineering is actually about that perspective shift and that mindset shift to be able to do to start to see things in a different way and innovate in a different way. So we try to advance that. And we're at the end there, Hugh. I'd just like to offer too that, you know, if any of you are sort of like me, I kind of go aha about 2 days later sometimes. So very reflective, and you know, if people have got reflective questions, or you know, you've come up with something that you think of in a couple of weeks' time or something, feel free to contact me. I'll pass my contact details on to Thomas and Hugh. So do you want me to leave the slides there, Hugh, and be able to refer to them, or?
Yeah, I think maybe leave the slides there. So if anyone has some questions, feel free to pipe up now. I'll have a quick look on the chat.
They can be questions, or they can be just observations or thoughts even.
Well, I could possibly start off with one. What's been on my mind lately is that apart from the carbon issue, I think you could argue that there's quite a lot wrong with our present civilization in social respects. And I think that, yeah, a social change of some kind, or a change in people's attitudes to life or beliefs about what's important, is likely to be necessary to get us to a more sustainable future.
I'd agree with that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Grant, this is Rob Dancer speaking here. I struggled to keep up with your presentation. I guess I had a brief introduction to transition engineering several years ago when I met Susan.
Yep.
some of the plots you put up, for example, one of the first one, the phenomenal transition challenge, 40 gigatons, and you have roughly 2030 as a threshold there. I'm still trying to figure out that chart. We have to make this transition engineering understandable and relatable to everyone. And I'm relatively technical. I'm an engineer, and I'm struggling. So I think that's a challenge we have. And to me, engineering necessarily, all that we do necessarily needs to be per the definition of transition engineering. And that's I think we need to realize that. And I think the other thing that we can use is we can use pardon my pronunciation, Te Ao Maori. So the Maori worldviews and the appreciation that the interconnectedness and interrelationship of all living and non-living things. I think we can really capitalize on that model that a lot of people do understand and can relate to promote the importance of transition engineering. Anyway, there's my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And so I should have made the point. So that graph showing the actual downshift in carbon, I used that really just as a backdrop, really. So it wasn't so much about the actual figures on there. So I should have made that point out. Apologies for that. I mean, it really is just showing that, you know, to actually get that level of downshift. That graph's been around quite a long time, so I kind of made, perhaps wrongly made the assumption that most people would have seen it. But yeah, the downshift that we need to do is radical. What you're saying, Hugh, is that actually there needs to be societal shifts and political shifts, as well as, you know, the work getting done differently.
And one thing about that societal shift is, if there's 51 kinds of engineers now, if you tack transition engineering on as number 52, it looks like, oh yeah, okay, so you're a transition engineer. What sort of stuff do you do? But actually, it kind of needs to be like, transition engineering is the big deal. All those subsets of engineering can make a contribution in some way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a nice way to put it. I mean, you could say, you know, the big game is taking number 52 and making it, you know, kind of like an overarching theme, and bringing things together, or being the glue, perhaps, that brings this together.
It's a pity it's not number 53. Then it could be the Joker in the pack, couldn't it?
Nice one, Lindsay.
Can I chip in with another couple of comments?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much, Grant. I thought that was great. I mean, it's not a comfortable presentation because we're not in comfortable territory, but I think you're exactly right. I was interested in the diagram that your colleague, that little handwritten diagram, which I think is quite cool. And the pathway for rational that you plotted in the middle, or he plotted in the middle. I think one of the spaces for engineering, and especially organizations like this, is to become recognized as the curator of sound information. Mm-hmm. You know, you had that diagram with all the noise and everything, and I think you had that phrase about an abundance of noise or something. And I'm not saying you can turn on that recognition, but I do think that's a very important space to be in, because there's so much stuff around that somewhere people look for an anchor point. And if it's any consolation to you, that Canadian diagram you put up with you know, people who know what engineers are. I happen to be an architect, and we're the profession that was lower than you. And I'm not making claims like you are, because I have more faith in the engineering profession to get us out of this than I do of my profession. But so I just want to make that comment, that I think the respected curator of information is great, but I'm not necessarily thinking it's the whole engineering profession. It might be a role that transition engineering fills. Thank you.
Oh, that was a wonderful perspective, Lindsay. I really like that. So curated, respected curation of information is the task or the function. And what we're saying is, I think perhaps, you know, the transition engineering is seen as a methodology and a process for arranging and organizing the thinking process, but maybe it becomes a recognized profession in terms of integrating a range of things or different engineering principles and approaches.
Can I add
Maybe-
to that, Grant?
Yep.
Yeah, I think we might have had this conversation once before, but I see transition engineering as part of a requirement that all engineers of all disciplines should be thinking about it. But the bit that interests me was this commercial relationship problem, where a client puts out a spec and then there's very little room they want it lowest cost, or all that sort of stuff. There's little room there perhaps to bend it in a way that takes into account the next 10, 20, 50 years. And so I think engineers need to be a lot more public about where they see these problems, where they see things going, so they can influence clients and influence people who are thinking about projects before they put too much definition on the project, so that they think really long term and think, well, if my business is going to survive, or if this bridge is going to survive, just how far do I need to think, and how do I write the spec? So, if engineers are probably a little bit too quiet, if they could speak up more in public about the issues and what is going on and get some more notice, and then get into the project and influence it and change it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Good one, Cliff. Yes, Kate.
If you are muted.
Thank you. And thanks, Thomas, for sending around the notice about this. I'm not an engineer, though I have a number of engineers in the family. But I really wanted to interrogate a couple of other things. And I should say that I'm one of the people in a profession that's not listed on your list because they're so distrusted, and that's economics. But I'm also in the right-hand side of that little diagram. And I want to interrogate a couple of things. So, I mean, it's really interesting hearing engineers talking amongst yourselves. As an economist, I was profoundly unhappy with a lot of the sort of narrow-minded economics that we got taught. So I ended up in academia as a economist who was interrogating, that. And I think one of the things I'd like you to think about is, what do you mean by zealous? And I've sat in seminars and so on from scientists at Vic who are trying to, for 40 years, literally, who are trying to get people to wake up and pay attention to climate change. And I ended up being a campaigner for the environment, the epitome of zealous. I've also asked scientists to be more zealous. And I'd ask you engineers to be more zealous too, because actually, unless we get a significant degree of interdisciplinary action, multidisciplinary action and thinking, and we collaborate much more, well, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition to get the planet so it survives. And we, I think, have to add to your leadership and what engineering should be doing. I think we need to add in consideration of the mindset change you talked about, ethics, consideration of the obligations that humans have to the planet, taking account of other species and not just humans, so we're not quite so anthropocentric. And We do need to look at social psychology, and the psychologists know a lot about how to change people's attitudes. And they also know that if you've got a dissonance between attitudes and behavior and values, the behavior, people tend to go on with the behavior and change their attitudes and values. So it's hell of a difficult. I also think that we need to make sure we not only get the science right, or in your case, the engineering sciences right, but we also get the right science. And that means that we have to get out of the very narrowly defined questions and actually make sure that, for instance, we're not just looking at the financial viability, but the viability of this in relation to the planet. And we have to respect other professions. And I would urge you all to be zealous, certainly be rational and science-based, but understand that being rational is not, and giving people information is not actually going to change their minds. That's really well established. So I would invite you folks to come and talk to and be part of ECO, which is the Environment and Conservation Organisations, talk to other professions. And actually, I've seen a lot of this in the discussions of wise response, where there's a lot of engineers, a lot of energy people, not so many social scientists. And it's terribly easy for people who are well-established professionals to look down on people who are pushing for change. And so be more zealous, please. And don't always just be rational, talk to people's values as well.
Well, I think your point there too, Kath, I agree with that. And I think there's an and as well. And it's quite possible to be sitting on that graph there, but actually be sitting on your hands and not doing anything. So, you know, it ultimately comes down to what we actually do. So we actually have to be taking action. And that's why we tend towards getting people to go, well, you know, having all the evidence under the sun and believing, if you're still not prepared to take action, if you're still haven't got that spirit to get out there and do something, it's actually for naught. And so we need to be active, and we need to be applied, and we need to be doing that in a way that actually enables us to continually build trust and learning, because actually, you know, the whole thing has to move continuously. So Lindsay, you've got.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Kath. I think you made good points, and your comment about information not being enough is completely valid. I just want to make an observation about that little diagram, looking at it a bit more. And I'm wondering if the position of the circles is a bit misleading, because the denialists are high on evidence and low on belief. And I would have thought that wasn't the right place for them. But also, I wonder, picking up on Kath's point, whether zealous couldn't be up to the top right of the rationale bit. In other words, when you have high evidence and powerful belief, that propels you to go in the right direction. So
I would be like, this is really the point of putting this up, because it's, you know, asking the questions, challenging it, and I'm sure it could be developed into something better and so on. But, you know, for the purposes of tonight, I think it's about what are those new questions we can come up with? What are those like inquiries that we can follow after this? And what are the things that people could start to think about doing differently, or sponsoring, or something, or whatever it is. But no, like, I loved your points there, Kath. Thank you very much for that. Is there any other comments?
Well, one, I don't know if this adds much, but in the end, we have to do something, and we have to do something quick. But on the other hand, one piece of advice I've read for people trying to get a big job done with limited resources is stand there don't do just something.
Mm.
So if you think about that, there's got to be a massive intellectual enterprise, I think, and a multidisciplinary one, and a big picture intellectual exercise to come up with a decent path forward.
Yeah,
And
because
all those things like the trusted curator of information and that cutting through the swirl, and that seems important.
absolutely it does, because the other thing that happens, you see, is that the way things are going in government at the moment, there's lots of people pursuing potentially ideologies and approaches to continuing things in a way which is probably not going to give us the change we need fast enough. So, I'm not knocking what people are doing in various programs and so on, but the point being is that, as you say, if there's not an overarching and integrated view of this, we could actually end up wasting a lot of time and a lot of resources for not much change, for not enough change. So that's the thing there. Lindsay, you got your hand up?
Well, I feel I'm hogging the floor a bit, but if there's nobody else, I'm happy to keep going. So those of you that were listening at the beginning might have heard me refer to interviewing Susan a couple of months ago. Susan was one of the first of a substantial podcast series where I interviewed about 16 experts on climate and local government. One of the striking things that came through is that well over half of them referred to much better forms of community decision making. Now, you just talked about integrated agreement, Grant, and they were talking, you might have heard of citizens' assemblies and so on. Now, the point about that was that it's a very substantial and structured process. It's very, very different to what we think of as consultation now. But a couple of the things that come out of it are generally people who start off in opposing camps often gain a lot of respect for the people in other camps and understanding for them. And often there is an agreed course of action. And I think one of the celebrated cases is the abortion legislation in Ireland, which was actually determined by a citizens' assembly process. I'm saying that because I've wondered if, I don't think the government will suddenly do this, but if anybody's in, say, academia and can get, say, research funding, I'm not in academia, research funding to conduct a decent scale event where you have the right parameters, the right range of people, I just wonder if that wouldn't be a very useful illustration of the power of getting to some sort of integrated agreement. Thank you.
I remember that stuff about publics as well. I've forgotten the name, but you called it a citizens' assembly, and I think I saw some place it was called a something public. So you do your statistics on your population and you assemble a representative piece of them and invite a group to be together who are truly representative of the population and put the question in front of them. And yes, the Irish abortion law worked out very well in a very difficult case too. So yeah, that might be a way forward.
You're exactly right about the proportionality, Hugh. And I think part of it is it's quite a long process and it has to be well funded so that the group, the large group, 80 people or however many, A, can get some compensation, a stipend or honorarium for their effort, and B, they can fund bringing in experts, somebody who can talk about energy or social cohesion or whatever it is. So it's not just let's get a bunch of people together by any means.
Jeff Foley has put a number of observations in the chat.
Sorry, I should be curating those. I'm a slow reader.
Just ask Jeff to speak.
Ask Jeff to speak. Good idea.
Jeff, you're on mute if you're hearing this and trying to speak to us.
Thank you. And I'm an engineer as well. Are our schools, our universities and technical institutes doing enough to set the culture for what should be a good, sustainable engineer to take us into the future? Who actually sets the culture for the engineering profession?
I can only speak about a long time.
That's sounding like a really good question, Jeff.
Mhm.
That's a very good question.
That's a big question. You know, I think you have to be a sociologist also to find out who defines or who generates culture. But I can tell you that the engineering degrees are internationally monitored, and the engineering bodies like Engineering New Zealand and Engineering Australia and all the others, they are the accrediting body that sort of looks after the consistency and also the contents of engineering degrees. And sustainability is one of the criteria that's being checked during the accreditation process. But obviously that system so far has not produced a single transition engineer. So something is missing at the moment.
I think maybe I'd jump in there, guys. You all seem to know each other really well. Hi, I'm Richie. I've been kind of fly on the wall of your presentations for a while now, and I think what you're all doing is pretty awesome. And to answer your question about who sets the culture, it's definitely not the young engineers are not setting the right culture, because if I look around the room here, where are they? And if I look at any other events that I would go to, the misinformation that I'm receiving is really at quite a high level, and we're pretty much doing the same thing over and over again. And I'm really glad that you as a group see some older, wiser engineers putting cool stuff out there for us to follow. And I'm disappointed every time when I come to your events, which I find really inspiring, that where are the young people? They're not here, they're not coming, they're not learning. So I think to kind of put my little 2 cents in is saying that, well, really the engineers that should be transitioning are not doing it because they're too busy repeating the same thing over and over again. They're not here. Anyway, that's me.
Fascinating.
That's
That's
a
really
very
good.
point. Sorry, Jeff.
We're as engineers for social responsibility, we're working on a new website and so on to try and attract more and more young people. So we are working towards that end. That is the end we want to have, where we have a majority of young ones ready to take the lead.
That's great. Yeah, I'd like to see more inspired young ones, and I would say that's where the solutions are going to come from. We spoke about influencing clients earlier. Well, that comes from engineers at the early stage in the project. We're the ones with the power. We need to be saying to the clients, this is what we can be doing. Don't do that. Actually, don't do that. You can do it like this rather. Actually, you can put a bike lane in. It's just not happening.
Oh, that's right. The nature of the problems we face too are it'll be interesting. So there's there was a question there from Jeff Foley talking about, have we got the intelligence to deal with the problems we face? I think if you look at the amount of, I think 98% of all scientists that ever exist are alive now. Like, it must be a phenomenal percentage of engineers that have ever existed are alive right now. Now, this raises a big issue in my mind, is this complete diffusion and cancelling out of this collective intelligence somehow. We've just developed into this mega complex organism that's unable to do anything with itself, really. Just, you know, the rate at which the population has exploded and the way that we've developed things. Yeah, we have this massive computational power, massive number of people, and, you know, various specialties, so many in fact that it was just too hard for us to make the right calls at the right times, it seems.
I don't know if any of you are aware of or follow Nate Hagen's, but his okay, thanks, Grant. But I mean, he's very much on that path, isn't he, of us being actually like a big human organism that's rather lost control of itself.
Mm.
And so is Yuval Noah Harari in his
Yeah,
his
totally.
history books,
Well,
same sort of approach.
It must be. I was reading where in 1900 there's an estimated 7 million scientists and engineers, and today we're approaching 100 million, but we're not having 10 times the number of discoveries or achievements. So we're getting buried in our specialization into becoming more and more useless somehow.
Potentially, that's actually interesting, because the problems of transition are probably not that complex to solve, but it's the willingness to do anything about them, I think, is the problem, isn't it? It's not like we don't have the smarts, but it's just the money's not there, the will doesn't seem to be in that direction. Communities or people are generally just want to carry on consuming what they consume or doing what they do. So there's a complex of social problems, and yeah.
It may be partly to do with humans' beliefs about themselves, and in the dawn of everything, so one's an anthropologist and one's an archaeologist, and they argue, and in great detail and with all the latest evidence, that humans are actually extremely flexible, can live in many very different kinds of societies, and in earlier times did live in societies that were very different, but geographically quite close. You know, like the Northwest Pacific American people were very different from the Californian indigenous American people. And there's I haven't finished it, I'm sorry to say, but he argues that there's a great deal of choice in what we think is important about being human. And that might be one way to look at getting unstuck. Now we think we have to be competitive. We have to make more money than the next guy. We have to, make sure that our standard of living in New Zealand stays well up above those other guys and somewhere else. And maybe we have to give up on a bit of that. You can tell I'm a nasty radical.
No.
Can I just make a point about that sort of lack of age distribution? I had a very salutary experience once of going to a sort of reunion of native forest protection campaigners, and there were 4 generations of campaigners there, and we went round the room, sort of people introducing themselves and making short comments, and one of the younger guys said, gee, it's just so good to see that there's some of you older people who care. We never knew that you were there. And we were having, the older people, of whom I was one, were thinking, gee, there's all these wonderful and really vital and motivated young people there. So I think there's a kind of stratification thing going on. And so one of the tasks is probably to actually engage with some of the, you know, the younger folks and find ways of having events where we can be in dialogue with each other. I mean, across disciplines, but also across ages. And I'm not good at envisaging what those should be, but I think you can do it. And it's worth trying to, say, talk to some of the climate strike young folks, because apparently there's going to be another climate strike this Friday, and just get to know some of them and get them engaged, because they're there, I can tell you. They may not all be engineers, but there's tons of young folks who think our sort of generation, and not including everyone in this, are just real shits who just never gave a stuff about them or the future or any of it. And they tend to generalize. So I think we need to get much more diverse groups together to work on this together. Sorry, I shouldn't be dominating your meeting.
Yeah, just to explain what's going on, the good engineers in New Zealand are divided into 3 groups, we found. The younger ones, they seem to join Engineers Without Borders. The active professionals, they seem to be in the Sustainability Society, and the older ones seem to be in Engineers for Social Responsibility. The 3 organizations have recognized that, and we try to hold hands and work closer together, but we always fall back into our own stuff and do our own things, and it's not actually working, but we from time to time make attempts, and perhaps we have to do it more frequently and better, that we actually work closer with these others that seem to capture different parts of the good engineers in New Zealand. That's certainly a reminder of what you are saying today.
May I throw in an additional thought?
Yes.
Please.
Thank you. I think, I suspect that nearly everybody on this call is probably pretty good at fairly rational thinking. In fact, rational is in that diagram, wasn't it? There, Grant. I think we're dealing with a society which very largely does not frame itself that way. I mean, we've got our national All Blacks rugby sports team promoting a petrochemical company and an engineering company that makes all its money out of oil rigs and things. You know, that, and people don't want their lifestyle taken away. They don't want their joy taken away. And we rather represent the people who are saying they ought to do that. And I think part of the challenge is for us to frame our perceptions a different way about the pathways to getting to really good places, not letting go of all the things that you really like doing, even though we can all be cynical about the fact that that's really going to be what's going to happen. So I'd like to put out there that part of our challenge is to map pathways to these promising and appealing destinations. They'll be very different to where we are now, but they're not like eating bean sprouts and wearing Hessian, you know. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we've reached 7:10 nearly, and I think it's been a pretty interesting discussion. So maybe it's time to wind things up there. And Grant says that he will work through the questions that have come up on the chat and put something out about those over the next week or two. So if no one has anything else to add, perhaps we would wind it up there.
Well, thanks, everybody. Feel free.
Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. Yeah, thanks very much for your presentation.
You're welcome.